Welcome to the Emperor's Dragon Part 1, Nestling, Chapters 16 and 17. So let's begin. The Emperor's Dragon, Nestling, Chapters 16 and 17. It wasn't often one was called into a meeting with the number one hero, All Might, and his only sidekick, Sir Night-Eye. In any other circumstances White Spirit would have been honored, or flattered. As it was, coming on top of everything else, she felt sick and tired and worried. It didn't help that both of them looked particularly grim. She'd never seen All Might without his patented smile. She sat down across the table and looked over at the two heroes. They simply looked at her. There was another man beside them, a police officer by the badge that was showing on his belt. "Look, what is this about?" "I'm rather busy," she snapped and inwardly winced. She was not going to be making a good impression. "We are here about the raid," Sir Night-Eye told her. The less said about the raid, the better. It was a clusterfuck with a capital C. She wasn't sure what went wrong though. Ruthless Shade wasn't meant to be that dangerous. They knew his abilities. They knew his followers' abilities, and yet, halfway through the raid things had started going wrong. They'd lost contact with Scarlet Scorpion and Freeze Star before they realized anything had gone wrong. And then there was a huge hulk of a man. Phantom hadn't stood a chance and Sage had a long road to recovery. And now, what they were finding as they went through the building was even more worrisome. Children's toys and clothes. The only consolation White Spirit could take was that the children had their own rooms with proper beds, and thus it didn't seem like it was a people smuggling operation. Those crammed the kids into as small a space as possible and definitely didn't give them toys. "What about the raid?" she snapped, before taking a deep breath. "Look, I'm sorry. Things are not going well," she offered the paltry explanation. She really didn't have time for this meeting. "I understand," All Might said before Sir Night-Eye could say a word. "We want to know what you found," he asked. "What we found? What we found doesn't make sense." White Spirit growled. "Look, before I launch into explaining everything, what do you know already?" she demanded, ungraciously. They obviously knew, or strongly suspected something, and she was tired. It would be better to get this over with. Sir Night-Eye looked offended, but All Might nodded. "Before we tell you anything, I'd like to confirm one thing. Do you have a good photo of Ruthless Shade?" he asked. White Spirit nodded and pulled out her comm. She tapped the buttons for a few moments, dumping the photo to whoever was in range. Right at the moment she didn't care who saw the image. All Might brought out his own phone and it pinged when it accepted the image. He tapped the screen, and looked at it before he held it up for Sir Night-Eye and the police officer to see. "That's him," the officer said. White Spirit knew what they were seeing. They'd gotten an image of Ruthless Shade with his cowl down. He had brilliant gold eyes and almost hauntingly white hair. It reflected whatever light was around, and in this image had taken on a blue hue. "It is," All Might confirmed before he looked up at her again. White Spirit noted that his eyes were sharp. "Ruthless Shade is not some minor villain," the number one hero said. White Spirit wanted to object, but she wasn't quite sure what she would be objecting to. Probably the implication that they couldn't handle one villain. "He's far more than that," All Might continued, before he took a deep breath. "In your dealings, have you ever heard of a man just called Sensei?" he asked. His blue eyes were quite serious. "He's a myth," White Spirit objected. She'd heard of him all right. He was meant to be some sort of boogeyman villains used to scare each other with. Except no one could tell her what was so scary about him. "Not a myth," the number one hero told her with a completely straight face. "So what does that have to do with my raid?" White Spirit demanded. Though she had a suspicion, she knew exactly what it had to do with her raid. "Your image confirms that Ruthless Shade is one of the alias this sensei was going by." For several long moments, White Spirit stared at them, silent. "Did you know?" she roared, coming out of her chair as her hands slammed into the table. "Did you have any idea that this?" "Please." All Might held up his hands. "We didn't know," he stressed. The police officer rose, and bowed. "I'm sorry. When the reports of your raid came through, I had a suspicion," he said, holding his bow to her. "It wasn't Ruthless Shade that tipped me off," he added, "but that large man you team reported." White Spirit trembled but slowly sat back down. "That wasn't a man," she spat. "It wasn't a man, not with the way that he had gone through walls and her underlings. The worst thing was, it didn't look like the man was actually trying to hurt them." We believe the large man is his bodyguard, Sir Night-Eye spoke finally as the police officer sat back down. And the fucking kids? She demanded. That brought the men up short. They froze as they looked at her and in a small, petty part of her mind. White Spirit went, ha, at their confusion, but she knew this was deadly serious stuff. Kids? All Might asked, his voice strangled. She slumped over the table and initiated a connection to her agency server which allowed her to pull up the photos of what they had found. She flicked through 2 bedrooms. The first obviously belonged to a child given the toys scattered around, along with school books. The other probably to a teen. There were multiple game consoles there, and there had been a console set up in the bar. She was somewhat thankful to see the school books. It reinforced that this wasn't a slave ring, or if it was the oddest one she'd ever heard of. Do you have any images of the kids? The police officer asked intently. Let me check, White Spirit said. They had captured devices and computers, but she wasn't sure if they'd managed to hack into any of them yet. She went to the data dump folder for the case, though to call it a folder was a bit of a misnomer. In electronic terms, it was a holding pen for all information downloaded from captured devices, just in case some of those devices had surprises on them. While it didn't appear secure, it really was. There were several data support people at her agency whose sole job was to ensure that. And to actually hack the devices. There were some days when they deserved the title of hero. Looks like we got lucky with one of the devices. The encryption sucked. Sir Night-Eye didn't look convinced. Usually White Spirit would agree, but she knew her people. If they said the encryption sucked, they meant it, and they would have checked that it wasn't because it was a honeypot. She opened the folder, and saw that there were images there. White Spirit threw the image from her phone to a projector that was in the room and then clicked the display so that it showed thumbnails of the images. Could you open the 5th one down from the left? The police officer asked politely. She did that and the image opened to show a green-haired kid. He was cute and she thought about 6. He had matching green eyes that looked huge and expressive. Freckles dusted his cheeks and, at least in the photo, there was an air of innocence about the kid. The only thing wrong with the shot was that the kid was blowing a jet of fire at a target, which was quite a way distant. The police officer pulled a satchel from the floor and brought out a case file. He opened it and pulled out a picture which he held up. You can use the screen, White Spirit said. Operational security, the man shrugged. She understood and was intrigued. Information was limited to paper copy only with very, very secure or sensitive cases. He's gotten older, the officer stated, and then passed the image to All Might. White Spirit saw as it was being passed that it was just a photocopy of an original. How much security was on this case? Photocopies were used only when the original case file was so sensitive that it was stored in a special vault. Access to that vault was monitored, and if anything was destroyed. There were very few crimes which carried a presumption of guilt. Destroying that special vault evidence was one of them. It didn't matter who you were either. It was a statutory charge. That's something, the number 1 hero said as if he was relieved. Did you find any information about the children? Sir Night-Eye asked. Uniforms, or other identifiers. White Spirit took a look at her agency server. Not yet, she stated. Sir Night-Eye nodded. He looked understanding. We want to be appraised of everything, he said. Ruthless Shade is far more dangerous than you believe, the sidekick added. She wanted to object to that, but White Spirit recognized that desire as her pride, and with 3 heroes lost in the raid, and one probably wounded to the point that she'd retire, there was no room for pride. Instead, White Spirit took a deep breath. I welcome any input, she said, bowing slightly over the table. She'd organize access for All Might and his sidekick to her servers later because she had a feeling that this wasn't going to be a simple case. All Might looked over at her, his face serious. It was scary. I am very sorry for your loss, he told her. The words were sincere and White Spirit wondered who the number 1 hero had lost to Ruthless Shade. Thank you, she replied, taking a deep breath as she sat there. This was not going to be easy. You can't tell her. Excuse me? Naomasa couldn't help but question Sir Night-Eye. This is the first break we've had on this case. And it's the first lead we've had in our case. The sidekick replied. The detective ground his teeth together. He knew, if it came down to it, that Sir Night-Eye would simply pull rank. The cases heroes worked on generally got precedence over police cases. And he knew that despite the fact that his case was dealing with child kidnapping, All Might's case, dealing with what could be the most dangerous villain the world had ever faced, would be considered more important. It didn't matter that there was every chance that the child was the villain's son. All the more reason for no one to care about him, and he already knew that public opinion would blame the mother for marrying the villain. It would be her fault, despite the fact that everything Tsukauchi had seen on this case said that this particular villain had acted like the perfect gentleman to her. It might have been an act, but there was nothing for her to see as being wrong. He sighed. At least he knew Yagi would be as frustrated as he was with the situation. I can't even tell her we found some photos? No. If he has someone watching her, he will know that we know. He already knows that we know, Naomasa reminded All Might's sidekick. The electronic copies of his case files had been tampered with. The image of Hisashi Midoriya was always smudged. If that wasn't evidence enough that the villain knew they were onto him, he didn't know what was. Sir Night-Eye shook his head. There's no reason for us to give away knowledge, he said. Look, this woman is alone. He tried the emotional angle. Knowing that it probably wouldn't go anywhere. She lost her husband and her son in one day and hasn't had anything since. We've not been able to find anything. Until now. I think she deserves to know that her son is still alive. The pro-hero shook his head. We can't take the risk. The risk of what? With this man, anything is a risk, Sir Night-Eye replied. And what exactly would you tell her? That we found photos of her supposedly quirkless son using a quirk, on the device of a supervillain. Who is probably her husband. Tsukauchi grimaced. When it was put like that, it did sound bad. I would hold off, and hope that we can locate the child, the pro-hero added, and Naomasa could hear the very faint note of sympathy in his tone. We don't even know what school the kid goes to, he pointed out. We are looking into it. Naomasa wasn't convinced. The kid's room had the standard, government-approved second-year elementary texts. His uniform was one of the generic ones used across Japan, and while they could run a search through biometrics, they had no idea where to look. The kid might have gone to the elementary school down the road, or across the city. Even so, he knew they had watchers on the local schools, looking for any green-haired, freckled boy, but Naomasa already knew they wouldn't be able to keep those watchers there for long. He suspected that whoever Hisashi Midoriya really was, he was already pulling the strings to have the case dropped in importance. No doubt Sir Night-Eye was aware of that as well, and so was wanting to gather as much information as he could. Tsukauchi sighed heavily. I'll wait until we get booted off this case, he told the sidekick. Sir Night-Eye didn't look pleased, but he knew what the detective was referring to. It will have to do, he muttered, and then went back to looking through the information White Spirit's team had found. It will, Tsukauchi said, putting the print of Izuku Midoriya using quite an impressive fire quirk into the file. One day, Inko Midoriya would see it. One day. All for One looked at his son. You wish to be a hero? He asked, careful to keep scorn out of his voice. Tomura would do that enough for him. Izuku nodded. He could tell his dad didn't approve, but he held firm. Unknown to Izuku, his father was quietly cursing. The premier villain in the world had known of his son's admiration of heroes. Tomura kept him very well appraised, and even though it had lasted for several years, he had genuinely believed that his son would grow out of it. Izuku was almost 7 and it appeared he hadn't. This called for more drastic measures. He would not have another family member betray him. Izuku, you do know it was heroes who attacked? Hisashi asked carefully, as he thought about how best to handle this. His son nodded again, and he could see that he was tense. All for One sighed. My little dragon, your mother is the one who wouldn't support you, he said gently. If you told her this, she would cry and say she was sorry and never let you do it. I am willing to support you, but I want you to know exactly what you are getting into. Being a hero isn't all that it's portrayed to be. Though if his actions now made Izuku decide that destroying hero society was best done from within, and that was his genuine motivation to become a hero, then All for One would alter his plans, but he doubted it would come to that. At that, Izuku looked slightly confused. Remember what you know about people, Hisashi said. What you've seen. People are cruel, Izuku said. And they fear what they don't know. All for One nodded. That even applies to heroes. He added. Heroes are just people. Because they don't know better, Izuku objected. They don't know you. They didn't, and he wasn't eager to let them know him either. Be that as it may, they are still people, he said, before he allowed his features to shift into a more contemplative gaze. There is one more truth that I've told you, but you were probably too young to realize it. Do you remember your first day of school? He asked his son. Izuku frowned, stretching his freckles as he tried to remember. There was something about the quirkless kids. There was, Hisashi nodded. But you were also called a sympathizer, he added. Izu's eyes widened as the memory no doubt returned. Everything you see happening now is repeated in adults, he whispered. Exactly, All for One was pleased. If Izuku could recall that exactly, he wondered if he should have his son tested for an eidetic memory. It would be so much easier if Izuku possessed that, rather than having to find a quirk to simulate it. Children are often more honest than adults as well. The cruelty adults try to hide, or justify, they simply do. So, if you want to become a hero, Izuku, I want you to learn about the people you will be protecting. Really learn about them. Know them at their worst, know them at their best, and know them as they really are, without anything hiding them. What do you mean? Izuku asked. Hisashi was pleased. His son wasn't arrogant enough just to rush in without consideration. You will be enrolled in a different school next year. To one that does not segregate the quirkless children, and you will be enrolled as quirkless, he added. Drastic times called for drastic measures. What will that do? Izuku gasped. It will show you how people truly are. And if you are to be a hero, then you must know that. He could tell, Izuku still didn't fully understand, but he would. One way or another. Last day. Okeko cheered before their class started. Yay! Minato echoed her sentiment. Izuku just sat there and watched his friends. They were so happy. Because they didn't know. Little dragon, is something wrong? Okeko asked when Izuku didn't cheer for the end of the school year. The question caused him to burst into tears and Okeko quickly looked at Minato. He shook his head. He had no idea what Izuku was crying about. It's only summer, Okeko stated. I'll be helping my parents but we'll still be able to see each other. Especially for your birthday. Izuku shook his head, his lips quivering as he tried to bring his tears under control enough to tell him what was wrong. I'm moving, he managed to gasp out. What? Minato asked. Dad is moving the business to Niigata, he explained. When? Okeko demanded, even as she tried to remember where Niigata was. All her young mind could tell her was that it wasn't close to Mie Prefecture. Next week, Izuku told them. He'd tried to argue that they could move just as well at the end of summer as the beginning, but his father had insisted that as soon as school finished, they were moving across the country. Tomura didn't care where they lived. The older boy had his games and that's all that seemed to matter to him. Kurogiri would go where he was told to, as would Gigantamakia. His dad had talked to him and had said that the move was only in part due to needing to enroll Izuku in a new school but mostly because he had new business ventures that needed to be attended to elsewhere. He explained that he usually spent a few years in each location and he'd already been in Mie long enough. Either way, there was no arguing with him and they were moving. His dad had tried to make it seem more exciting by telling Izuku he could begin some physical training since his spatial awareness training was about as good as it could be for the moment. It had been months since Tomura had snuck upon him and the older boy didn't try much now. Which was just as well since Izuku didn't think he'd seen Tomura wear his gloves at all lately. Not even when playing his favorite games. It didn't change the fact that they were moving. He could see that his answer had upset Okeko and Minato but before they could say anything. The bell rang. Minato looked torn. He had to go to his homeroom. We'll still be friends, he said by way of parting. Okeko looked at Izuku after he left. We will, little dragon, she repeated forcefully. And we can write, and call as well. She wasn't sure if Izuku had a phone. It wouldn't matter because she didn't but she could get his dad's number and call that from one of her parents' phones. Izuku nodded, and Okeko was glad to see that he looked slightly more relieved now. They'd make something work. This is all your fault. Izuku jerked up at this hiss. His green eyes widened as he saw Tomura standing in the doorway. It's not my fault, he objected. He'd been working in his notebook. It is. The older boy insisted. If you didn't want to be a hero, none of this would be happening, he growled the sentence, glaring between the fingers of the hand that covered his face. I didn't ask to move. Izuku snapped back. He didn't ask to change schools and move away from his friends. I just got everything back from that stupid hero raid and now I have to move again. Tomura continued to rant. I have to pack up and then unpack it and I'll never be able to find stuff again. Izuku had packed up his room earlier. The raid, which his dad had explained was from heroes who feared what he did, though Izuku wasn't sure how that worked since his dad was a businessman, but he knew he didn't know everything his father did, had actually made packing easier for him. He hadn't been as demanding as Tomura had to replace everything. Kurogiri had given him a few boxes and soft bags. He'd packed his clothes into the bags, and books into the boxes. The Misty Man had said he would take care of the bed, chair and desk that was in his room. Since he'd cleaned everything out, he'd come out into the common room they had set up so that it could work on his notebook. You could unpack neatly, Izuku suggested. He knew it was a mistake the instant he said the words. Tomura's gold eyes flashed, and the other boy lunged forward. Izuku slipped off the chair before it disintegrated. His notebook was clasped in his hand and he could feel the pages crinkling under his grip, but he wasn't going to let Tomura get another one. Izuku dodged left and had to jump to the side as Tomura screamed and swung his right hand out, flailing as he tried to hit anything. Thankfully, Izuku was far enough away that the older boy missed. Izuku dove forward, focusing on the door. The setup at this place was slightly different from the last location. It was similar. They had a kitchen, a bar, and a common room, but there was more space between them. He thought Kurogiri was packing up the kitchen. He heard Tomura's yell from behind him and that made Izuku put on another turn of speed. He darted down the corridor. Tomura was hot on his heels. It's not my fault, Izuku yelled. It is. Tomura screamed. Izuku slammed himself into the wall at the right as Tomura's clawed hand passed through where he'd been. The older boy's thumb caught on his t-shirt, but Izuku didn't have time to care about that. He scrambled along the floor before risking again. He felt the tug on his shirt but didn't pause. Tomura howled. Fucking bastard! He screamed. Izuku kept running down the corridor. He could have taken Tomura's quirk, but he knew he shouldn't. His dad had pointed out that people did not like the thought of losing their quirk. Izuku had never asked his friends, but he'd spoken to Kurogiri about it and the Misty Man had said it was the worst thing Izuku could do, so Izuku tried to avoid it. Usually he could push Tomura away using Kali Imperium, but he needed a moment to focus on that and the other boy wasn't giving him any time. Izuku burst into the kitchen area and looked around frantically. His stomach fell when he realized Kurogiri wasn't there. He didn't know where the other man was, and he knew his dad was not here. The only other place people might be was in the bar, but to get to that, he'd have to get past Tomura again. And that was unlikely. Izuku knew the other boy wouldn't care either. He backed up against one of the cupboards and used the time to pull his quirks to him. If he kept his face to Tomura, then he could use fire breath to keep the other boy off him. Izuku spat out a small tongue of flame as a warning. That's not going to save you, Tomura snarled. His hands were in front of him, shaped as claws. Except his right thumb was hanging at an odd angle. Tomura, your hand. Izuku used up precious air. Not going to save you. But. Tomura snarled and lunged forward again. Izuku had enough space to dodge and the cupboard door he had been against crumbled into dust. He managed to take a deep breath and shot a breath of flame towards Tomura. He could control the heat of the flame and hadn't made it too hot. Kurogiri would be upset if he injured Tomura. The older boy swatted the flames aside. You can't be a hero against me, he growled. I'm not trying to be a hero. Izuku objected, but he knew Tomura wasn't listening. The gray-haired boy lunged again, extending his right hand. Izuku flinched but felt a stab of panic when Tomura corrected his aim. He wasn't going to get away. He grabbed at his quirk, before yanking at the older boy's gray quirk even as he felt Tomura's hand grab his arm. Izuku froze. Tomura froze. Nothing happened. Izuku looked at his arm. Tomura was grasping it and his flesh was white from the pressure. All fingers were down, but he almost breathed a sigh of relief before he realized he'd better not. The thumb, which had been caught earlier on his t-shirt, was hanging down. Which meant that it wasn't touching his arm. TCH. Tomura growled, and before he could bring his left hand over to touch him, Izuku yanked at the quirk he'd grasped. Tomura stepped back though, letting go of Izuku's arm before he took a step back. Give it. The older boy demanded. Izuku glared at him for a moment, judging what Tomura would do. The aborted attempt to disintegrate him seemed to have calmed him down. His yellow eyes were still glaring, but there was a more controlled glint in them. Even so, Izuku pulled on Kali Imperium before he shoved Tomura's grey quirk back at him. The older boy seemed to shiver for a moment as he stood still. "It's your fault," Tomura hissed before he stalked away. Izuku watched him go, hardly daring to breathe, and when he heard the other boy slam the door to his room, he sucked in great lungfuls of air as he slid to the ground. He didn't even mind the dust that puffed up around him from the destroyed cabinet door. It wasn't his fault that they were moving, and he wasn't trying to be a hero with Tomura. The other boy should be thankful that he hadn't behaved like a hero. He'd played the games Tomura lent him, and those heroes always killed the villain. If he was being the hero, then Tomura was being the villain, and killing Tomura was the way things were in those games. But the game wasn't reality, and Izuku knew heroes of today weren't the paragons of light they were portrayed to be in the games. They were good, but still human. Izuku leaned his head back. "It's not my fault." End chapters 16 and 17. The Emperor's Dragon, Nestling. Author note: yes, Tomura is still a brat. All he sees is that his life is going to be upheaved because of All for One moving them. He doesn't know why they are moving, he just knows that it is interrupting his game time, and that's enough to attack Izuku. Thank you for listening. Join me again to listen to the next chapters.